Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Democracy Exchange with the Depot, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding. I'm back as your host, Samantha Conrad. Today we have another special guest, Dr. Fritsch. He is an expert on international politics and the relationship between technology and international affairs, political economy, and for the sake of today's episode, he will be sharing insight on AI's role in the political field. Dr. Fritsch, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And to start the episode off, I'm going to, like usual, briefly discuss kind of what our topic is, which is for today AI. And I'm going to discuss a little bit why we're talking about it. So AI, if you've been watching the news, seems to be everywhere lately. However, AI is, which obviously stands for artificial intelligence, is kind of like a broad topic. It's a bit of a generalization of a technology that covers a very wide range of issues. And since its kind of beginnings in the 20th century, the capabilities of AI have evolved very rapidly and don't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. And this leaves some people to wonder where to go from here and what a world with AI might look like in the future. And just after that brief explanation, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fritsch. And to start our first question, I'm going to ask you just kind of how have you seen AI progress and evolve over the course of the past decade or so?
Okay, so that's a long, I mean, the last 10 years, that's a very short time span actually, right? I would say AI sort of has had a history of probably 50, 60 years almost. So I think it's only come sort of more into sort of the public sort of the public's awareness in the last 10 years, and that's because we have seen these dramatic leaps, right, in terms of what AI technology is capable of doing actually. And if you study the history of AI, it's actually a very long progression, right, of baby steps, right, where a lot of researchers, scientists, engineers have contributed to, collectively, so to speak, to this evolution, right? So I think the last 10 years have been so dramatic because we just see these not just scientific and technological breakthroughs, but also the sort of what we call the diffusion of AI into our daily lives, right? I mean, it's now ubiquity is the key term here, right? You can find it in almost every dimension of our lives. And so as people become more aware of its presence, and because currently there's also, of course, a real hype, right? I mean, it's an AI. We witness an AI hype. So it's now firmly planted in sort of the public's consciousness, right? And with that, people become more aware of AI's potential, right, to change our lives, and that could, of course, be for the better. And on the other hand, people also start discussing more the potential pitfalls, right? The potential negative side effects. So I guess that's where we are at this point, right? So it's and when you think about it in terms of applications, maybe I just said people are more aware of it, but it's just as true that quite often they're not aware of it, right? Because it just sort of works in the background and does its thing, and the term that we use for that kind of situation where technology has become so widely accepted actually that people simply don't know that it's actually working in the background. That's which we use the term black box for that, right? So AI has been quite successfully black boxed, right?
And kind of on this topic of the evolution of AI, how have you seen the use of AI change over time by, I guess, the global general public and global businesses?
So, like many other things in the past, the last 50, 60 years, it started out initially in sort of the military realm, right? So a lot of the early AI was financed by military agencies, right? Even without exactly knowing if this would lead to any practical outcomes, right? But it was the Cold War So they just threw money at it and hoped that something magical would come out of this. Now the whole field is really dominated by corporate interests, right? So it's big companies like Google, Meta. I mean, we all know these companies. We use their products every single day. So it's that sort of whole landscape has almost completely flipped, right? So it's now private investors that invest, and a lot of these companies obviously also collaborate with universities, right? So a lot of AI programs throughout the world, not just in the US. That's one prominent sort of way to access research funds, right? Is that you work with these companies. So they have their cooking sort of on many different ovens basically, right? So and with that obviously they accumulate a tremendous amount of knowledge, expertise, and incorporate that then into their applications, right? So so that's one of the big developments, right? It's almost like a mega trend, right? The other one is obviously that there's a global arms race going on, right? I mean that's at least the term that's used, arms race. I don't think it's a great term, but it's sort of, for a lot of people, they immediately sort of get that analogy, right? So there's a lot of competition going on between countries, between companies, to be at the cutting edge of this technology, because it's the next big thing, right? That's also part of a hype that everybody thinks if they don't jump on that train, they're gonna lose out in many different ways, right? Because AI is so the fascinating thing about AI is that it's what we call a dual use technology, right? It's just like almost any form of digital technology that came before, right? It can be used in a sort of the civilian realm or the economic realm, but it also can be used for military purposes, right? So you have this really interesting sort of convergence of private financial interests mixed with sort of geostrategic considerations, right? Where countries are trying to stay in the game or get in the game, actually. Right?
And how do you think that kind of global AI arms race has played a goal in like their actual government practices? And do you think that this will change over time?
So from my point of view, there are two aspects to the question. One is that countries look at artificial intelligence as something that impacts their what we in international relations call capabilities, right? So it's basically something that you need, or you think you need, in order to develop economically, or improve maybe your military security, right? So it's a concern in that sense, but it's also what I see more and more is that, of course, AI then gets used by governments, right? I mean, it's getting incorporated into government agencies, right? Ministries, and they use it for all kinds of things: prediction, forecast, data analysis, data collection, very prominently, of course. So that's the second aspect to that AI itself is now increasingly getting applied by governments for all kinds of purposes. And as it gets sort of integrated into public policy, right, it starts changing behavior, practices, the way people and governments think about a wide variety of problems, right? There's a strong push to try and quantify as many things as you possibly can quantify, because you want the data, right? And maybe a lot of the listeners are aware of that's one of the big issues or challenges is the quality of the data, right, that gets fed into algorithms, right? Is the people have heard about biased data or polluted data or compromised data. So that's that there's a data challenge. And then the other question is, what does the algorithm actually do, right? That's sort of one of the biggest challenges I see in the future, is to be able to understand how the data actually gets processed and analyzed. And there's a growing concern in the science community, in the AI community, that we increasingly write algorithms that are able to learn on their own, and the latest stage even start reasoning on their own, but we don't understand how the algorithms get to those outcomes, right? So again, it's a sort of a black box that even the experts who wrote the algorithm in the first place don't fully understand. And that creates, of course, a bunch of problems and challenges. We see a lot of new sort of terminology popping up in the field, like traceability, explainability, transparency, right? I mean, you fundamentally start seeing the delegation of data analysis, or at times even decision making to some extent, by these algorithms without fully understanding how they function, right? And that then creates trust issues, right? And actually can have real world implications, right? So those are sort of the big trends that I see at this point.
And how do you think that this, I'm going back again to this like global AI arms race. I know that obviously in the news we've been seeing that there have been tensions between many different countries, but especially US and China in this, just in general. And do you think that this kind of global AI arms race has like exasperated tensions between countries, or has improved? How do you think it's affected it?
I think it's sort of, it's like an amplifier, right? Because it's new and everybody is getting on board and wants to be on top of the food chain, so to speak, right? Or the cutting edge of innovation. It's just another dimension, right? But because it's going to be such a cross-cutting technology, right, affecting so many different policy areas, it's the stakes are quite high, right, for all of these countries. And so I think it really creates a pressure for not just the big powers, obviously, who have been at it for quite a while, but also for smaller countries, right, that feel like we have to be in this. There's really no escape from this, right, unless you want to be cut off, right? But there was one more thing actually that I forgot to say previously. I mean, it kind of is another dimension of this at the global level. It's not just countries and companies that get in the ring, but also a lot of international organizations actually start relying on these technologies. And I just was last week we had the annual conference of the International Studies Association in Chicago. So that's the biggest sort of academic association for the study of international relations. And I saw a couple papers there where people looked at what's going on in international organizations, for example, the UN. And at this point, the UN uses hundreds of AI-based applications for all kinds of purposes, right? I mean, a lot of it is, again, data collection, data analysis, forecasting, predicting. But even the UN at this point has no clear idea how many applications are really used, right? Because many of them are developed in-house, others are sort of developed in collaboration with the big companies, right, like Microsoft or so. So it's even in those organizations, and that's despite all the worries, right, that are sort of associated with those technologies. Even in those institutions, the the people feel like we need this, right? We have to rely on that. So I just wanted to add this to show that it's not just a country thing or a company thing. It's truly a global phenomenon, right?
And you also mentioned earlier, you were talking about some of the more ethical implications of AI and just kind of like the spread of misinformation and stuff like that. I would like to ask, what are some of the ethical implications of AI in the workforce and kind of the global economy? And I have heard in the news certain people mentioning that they fear that they're going to lose their jobs to artificial intelligence. Do you think that these fears are well-founded?
I think the fear as such is justified, right? I mean, this is, for somebody who also studies sort of the history of the global economy, in the context of technological innovation, that concern in and of itself is not new. I'm old enough to remember the introduction of the internet, right? And there were similar concerns with that. There are a lot of studies out there that try to wrestle with that question, right? How AI is going to affect labor markets. The short answer is we don't know yet, right? Because we're sort of at the beginning of AI, right? Being introduced widely into manufacturing and that sort of all dimensions of the global economy. So we don't know yet how it's really going to affect labor markets. As you've pointed out, there are sort of the concerns that it might actually eliminate certain types of jobs, right? So that's like the worst case scenario where you say, okay, no, we're really going to get rid of certain types of jobs. And in this time, it's not necessarily going to be unskilled labor, right? Unskilled jobs. It's very unlikely for, let's say, a cleaning service, right, to lose its job or to lose its business, because those are unfortunately rather lowly paid occupations, right, that are nevertheless, from a technological standpoint, could be quite challenging, right? So a robot, an AI-empowered robot, could probably not do the job of a cleaning personnel in a house, in a sort of even a university building. And it also would be much too expensive, right? It wouldn't pay off. On the other hand, you could see, and that's also true for a lot of, let's say, trades, right? I mean, a pipe fitter or a carpenter is not going to get replaced, right, by AI. Other occupations might see more challenges, right? And so what I'm trying to say is this time AI could sort of be a technology that disrupts white collar jobs to some extent, right? Now the question is, are those jobs going to get completely eliminated, or which is the zero-sum sort of perspective, or are these jobs going to be enhanced with AI, right? So that means that people can become more productive, right, by using AI. So the final word on this is we're far from a final word on this, right? You do see in reality a lot of AI in the context of robotics, right? And that, of course, impacts particularly manufacturing. So all these repetitive tasks, right, that can be easily mechanized, right? If you think about car manufacturing, for example, or other types of manufacturing jobs, there I see a big potential, right? It could also be in other sectors, depending on how fast the technology evolves. For example, truck driving, right? So anything that's repetitive and where it economically pays off to introduce that technology, right? I mean, it really has to pay off. Otherwise, you're wasting money, right? So if you want to talk about the ethical dimensions of this, that's a little tough, right? Because, I mean, we generally always look for more efficiency, right? I mean, this is one way that economies grow, right? You try to improve labor productivity or output. And we've done this for thousands of years, right? Plus, there's one more thing. From every other technology that we have seen introduced in the past, you could also argue, well, we don't even know what types of new jobs might get created, right? So it's not just about eliminating existing jobs. There are also opportunities for new types of occupations, right, that we haven't yet figured out. So at this point, for me, it's very hard to say this is going to be absolutely terrible or this is great with many opportunities. I think the reality is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. One of the areas that I've actually seen has kind of already been affected is not actually a job within and of itself, although you could argue that it's kind of some companies are using AI to look through job applications. And there have already been ethical questions raised as to, well, what do they exactly look for and kind of who is getting chosen over other people, so to speak, at least in the U.S.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Right? Which brings us back to how was the algorithm trained, right? I mean, if there are sort of, and that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Or ethical challenges. How do you make the algorithm sort of unbiased, like neutral? So that's a very good point. There have been other examples, right? It goes down a similar sort of argumentative route where, you know, I just recently read, and I was kind of surprised. I didn't know that probably almost any loan application under $50,000 nowadays is reviewed by an algorithm.
Really? That's fascinating,
right?
Actually.
I mean, let's say at least the majority of loan applications that are smaller, not like, you know, the $500,000 mortgage for your house, right? But any sort of smaller loans are mostly reviewed by algorithms. Right? And there have been stories about algorithmic bias based on, you know, zip codes and things like that, right? Where if the zip code is associated maybe with a socioeconomically less prosperous area, then there might be a higher chance that it gets rejected, right, or denied. Although the loan applicant maybe is solid, right? So those are challenges. Another dimension that's not economic, that's sort of more in the military sphere, is if you think about autonomous weapon systems, right? There's a very strong trend towards automating decision making. Despite the fact that, I mean, at this point, people are still in the loop, right? Human decision makers when we think about drone strikes, right? But there's a trajectory in the future that we might see more autonomously made decisions, right, on when to strike, what to strike, and the ethical question there is obviously, well, what happens when, again, based on an algorithm that maybe is somehow flawed, a wrong decision is made, right, with fatal consequences, and like who bears the responsibility for that, right? Was it the programmer? Was it maybe the human that was in the loop somewhere, like on the sidelines, right? So plenty of other ethical dilemmas, autonomously driving cars, right? I'm gonna actually be talking about this today in a class I teach right now on the politics of AI. It's called the famous trolley problem.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So how do you program that, right? What's the algorithm supposed to choose, right? The child, the adults, or crash into, you know, what matters most, right? Those are very difficult decisions.
Yeah. I actually hadn't even thought about self-driving cars. It's one of those things where it's like...
Yeah. So, I mean, these are all... I'm not saying that the algorithm necessarily is worse, right? Or performs worse than a human being. I mean, we all drive, we all see horrible driving behavior, right? So that's... So I'm not the person that condemns these things, right? But I'm just those are real world challenges, right? That scientists, engineers have to figure out, and actually also political decision makers, right?
It's a very kind of difficult situation because there's not really one good answer.
Exactly,
I don't
right.
think. And kind of speaking on that topic of ethical decisions and kind of some of the more negative effects of AI, this is probably the most talked about topic. What I'm about to talk to next is kind of the role of AI. What do you think about the role of AI in the spread of misinformation, specifically on social media through things such as like deep fakes and other stuff that AI is capable of doing? And do you kind of see this becoming a bigger problem in the future? How do you kind of see that going?
Absolutely. It's that's one of the things that really worries me because of the things that can be done already at this point are at times really convincing. And I would, that's a tough one. We always talk about people need sort of media literacy, right?
Yeah.
That means knowing how these things work and being sort of critical and checking the sources and all of this. But I think with these types of technologies now and what is possible, that's becoming even more of a necessity, right? How we can achieve that, and I mean, it's almost like you need a social media, digital media, AI literacy, right? But even, I guess, for experts, it's very hard to catch these things, right? Or you have to actually be an expert. So, that's a really, maybe we'll have to start like labeling things. But again, if you're thinking in the realm of propaganda or misinformation, obviously nobody's going to label something like this as, oh, this was made with AI, right? I mean, the whole point is to pretend as if this is real, right? But that's really something that I find worrisome because fundamentally it undermines transparency and trust, right? And if we stop trusting, the things we see, especially the things we see, right, as visual as human beings are, that's going to be a really big problem in the future.
And we've kind of already seen that problem on like a personal person-to-person level. How do you see that problem evolving in like a global government scale?
Well, you could argue that these possibilities, right, that are opened up through AI are sort of a great propaganda tool for countries, right? Even before AI became sort of a big thing, I remember a couple of years, maybe about 7-8 years ago, I saw sort of images that had been manipulated, right? And in this case, I think it was an image of an Iranian missile test. But instead of one missile, the image they put in as if 20 missiles had been launched simultaneously, right? So, I mean, if something like that, I'm not saying could trigger like a conflict, but it's just inserting more insecurity into the whole international system, right? Because you're gonna need, again, it's an arms race, right? You create these things, then you have to come up with ways to analyze and detect these things, right? So it's sort of it's a back and forth, right? Also in this sort of dimension of social media, right? And sometimes this could be just traditional propaganda, right? But here increasingly I see and I'm strictly an observer. I'm not on any social media actually. I really sort of avoid this, but I see sort of how the mix between propaganda and news, right, is sort of all of these boundaries get blurred more and more, right? And so I think for us as individuals, even for the experts, it's getting harder, right? You have to be even more vigilant, right, with information.
And I know this is in kind of its very infancy, but have you seen any efforts made by different countries to kind of navigate some of the legal challenges of AI in the personal, business, or maybe government, even government areas?
So there is, again, based on papers as I listened to last week, there is a lot of countries now have national AI strategies, right, or AI policies. Now could just be a like any policy, that's just basically a writing down of what the country might want to achieve in the future, right? When it comes to regulation, I think we can say that there's a wide variety of how countries approach this, right? Right now, personally speaking, I'm working a lot on the European Union, and the European Union has distinguished itself in some ways as the leader when it comes to AI regulation. Last August, like last summer, the European Union passed the AI Act. So that's sort of the first comprehensive effort to actually really regulate AI, at least the high-risk AI, like, well, it regulates sort of, there are different categories of AI depending on risk levels, right, to individuals. I don't want to bore you or the listener with the details, but some of the most risky AI technologies are outright banned in Europe, right? Like social credit scores. Like basically the EU said we don't want to be like China, right? Where we have comprehensive like public surveillance of individuals, facial recognition, all of this gets connected with like social network analysis, who you hang out with, what you say online. And if you criticize the government, you might be excluded from certain things. Like you can't apply for a loan, you're not allowed to use the bus, right? I mean, that kind of stuff is outright banned in Europe, right? We don't regulate a lot of other lower risk AI, right? So, but anyway, so there's in Europe you have a sort of a rather pronounced sort of strategy now. You have obviously there are three big players, right? You have the EU, you have China, and you have the US, right? If we stick with those three. Like China, it's obviously more state controlled, right? In many ways, kind of like this 1984 George Orwell, sort of world. In the US, very little regulation, right? And with the prominent presence of a lot of AI interests now in Washington, I don't really see more strict regulation in the US in the future. I mean, in the near future at least, right? Maybe on the state level to some extent. Like some states have implemented certain regulatory policies, like California, So there's a wide variety. Any regulation is always sort of a complicated topic because while the Europeans now have this sort of regulation out, and I've read the AI Act, and let me tell you, it's a lot. It's a 300-page document.
Wow.
So, and it's not the most thrilling document to go through,
sure.
right? But the challenge still is, okay, so now we have this thing, and I'm just using this as one example of how hard this is. But now the question is, okay, how is this going to get implemented on the ground, right? It's one thing to have these lofty goals, and you want to protect the citizen and the consumer from all kinds of potential hazards. But on the other hand, you don't want to kill innovation, right? So if the EU asks companies now to document how they develop algorithms, right, and to make everything transparent and explainable and traceable, then this puts a really big burden on little startup companies, that just try to come up with the next big thing, It might be easier or even actually not that easy even for large companies, to fulfill those requirements. And the question is always, so how is this gonna affect innovation, right? When you are in that global competition, right? And if you don't develop certain things, somebody else will, So those are some fundamental challenges. I mean, again, this is in and of itself nothing new.
Yeah.
But because of the rapid pace, which is actually another challenge, right? This AI develops very quickly these days. It's hard even for people like me who spend a decent amount of time trying to follow these things to actually stay on top of developments. um, so speed is really a problem for regulation, because you're always going to be 3 steps behind, right? And that's what happens to the AI Act, right? There are already debates that it's already outdated, and we have to go back to the drawing table and modify it, right? So on the other hand, you have the US approach, which is like, yeah, just do whatever you want, more or less, and which is, I find, also problematic, right? Because then you're basically relinquishing control, right? As a in terms of public policy, right? I mean, it's almost like, and again, the previous administration at least came out with guidelines, right? Which was sort of, in an ideal world, here's what we would like these companies to do, right? And the things we would like you to pay attention to, like, privacy, explainability, things like that, right? Because the reality is, we, in our daily lives, provide an incredible amount of data, right? That goes to these companies, and they use it, right? I mean, you've heard this famous saying that if it's for free on the internet, then you are the product, right? And what the product is at the end of the day is all your user data, right? The things you look at, the things you listen to, the things you buy, the places you go to, all of it.
I mean, we've all heard the joke that, like, your phone listens to you, but it's real.
The apps you use, and it's every single app, right? It's not just your phone. It's like, if people are on so many different platforms, and I mean, let's be honest, who has ever read the terms of agreement?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Right? So it's not just one agreement, right? When you download the app let's say in the App Store, right, on your iPhone. But that app then so it's like a cascading effect, right? That app will use the data and sell the data on to somebody else, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? And then all of this happens behind the scenes, right? So, and we provide this for free, right? So that's a fascinating thing. Now, there are lawsuits actually making their ways through the courts, because some media organizations, like, for example, the New York Times, have sued, like, AI companies, right? Like Google. I don't know if it's Google or Meta or both of them, for basically just skimming all that information, all these articles off the internet, right? Because the New York Times says it cost us a lot of money, right? We have to pay journalists to actually produce these things, and you use that data for free to train your algorithms, which you then sell back to the public, Yeah. So, so that's just another ethical challenge, actually, right?
And kind of on this topic, for our last kind of topic of the day, we've talked about, of course, the ethical and kind of more unfortunate and problematic uses of AI, but how can governments, businesses, and even like on a personal level, how can we work kind of around the world to develop ethical uses of AI, and what would an ethical future in the world of AI look like?
Well, first of all, it's going to be very hard. And that's going to be sort of that you're really asking sort of the big question, right, at the end. It as with every regulatory effort, at least at the global level before, it has to happen collectively, right? Because I mean, it doesn't have to. You can also, the second best route obviously is always sort of, instead of having nothing, is to have, like, obviously individual countries or at least regions, come up with their frameworks. And that's what's kind of happening right now, right? In the absence of a sort of more serious global efforts, right, to tackle AI, we see countries sort of teaming up, like, in groups, right, regionally mostly. The geopolitical situation right now is not very conducive to global efforts because of a lack of trust, competition, right? Because of that arms race again, right, that countries are in. So while you often hear sort of declarations like, oh yeah, this is a big challenge and we really have to do something about it. On the other hand, I don't really see a willingness, right? And again, it's because it's too new. It's the hot stuff. Everybody wants it. Nobody wants to be restrained at this point to figure out, what's even possible, right? So yeah, I mean, right now I'm not too optimistic about a global approach. That's the bad news, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's all doom and gloom, right? Would it be better to have a global approach? Probably, right? Because then it might also be easier for companies, right, to navigate the world. It's easier to have one standard, right, than having to deal with, let's say, 193 different standards, right? So, plus we might have to, I mean, we kind of know at this point the ethical challenges, right? But I think at the end of the day, there has to be a willingness, to tackle these, right? And until we see that emerging or becoming more powerful, right? I'm a little, I mean, I don't want to be a doggy downer, right? A pessimist, but that's really what it boils down to, right? There has to be a willingness to tackle this. Right? And then, of course, you'll see all the usual things, right? You will see lobbying, efforts to water it down, right? And we even have to sort of agree on what we think the ethical challenges are.
Yeah, of course.
So there has to be some sort of agreement first about these things. Because what's bad for you and me might be not a problem for somebody else. Right?
That's true.
So, and a lot of people say, well, I don't really care about privacy. I like the convenience of all these apps. I don't care about what happens with my data, right? That's something else I've been thinking about quite a bit, right? I mean, a lot of people know or have a gut feeling about what's going on, but they're like, I still like that app, so I'll make that deal with the devil, so to speak.
It's like the frog in the pot sort of thing.
Right. And unless you have some sort of negative experience with that, you probably are not that concerned about it, right? I would also say that there are really cultural differences when it comes to these things, right? I mean, as somebody from Central Europe, I'm much more sensitive to things like privacy, right? And you can see this in a lot of European countries. People are generally more private. They're more concerned with privacy. Here in the US, people don't really have a problem with that, right? Convenience usually trumps these concerns, right? Yeah. So that's something else to keep in mind, right? That it's not the same for everybody around the world.
Yeah. Dr. Fritsch, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. This has been Democracy Exchange with the Depot. Thank you to the Depot social media and podcast team, Samantha Perry and Maria Lettieri, and special thanks to Falcon Radio and Professor Robert Alexander, our founder. I've been your host and researcher, Sam Conrad. Join us next time at Democracy Exchange with the Depot. To find the video version of this podcast, you can find us on our YouTube page at BGSU Depot. Bye for now.